So we finally got some answers as to why Amazon's The Rings of Power looks like it's going to be a hot mess. Vanity Fair wrote a follow-up article to their previous one titled 10 Burning Questions About Amazon's The Rings of Power. The first question, will it look like The Lord of the Rings? Quote, in creating this new world, McKay and Payne's goal was, in McKay's words, different but familiar. While the series is not a precise continuation of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, it shouldn't clash with the cinematic world fans have come to know and love. Actors like Morphy Clark and Robert Aramayo were cast in part because they could age into the older versions played respectively by Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving in Jackson's films. No, they can't. Neither of them look anything like Blanchett or Weaving. Not even close. It goes on, quote, it's worth remembering, if only for legal reasons, that this is not the exact same world. The production design, though similar, is not trying to match the Jackson films. It shouldn't clash, but it's not trying to match it either. Yeah, that makes no sense. Here's the problem though. Jackson's films are the world everyone's familiar with and the world that everyone wants to see. Also, it's not entirely true that they're not trying to match Jackson's films. Galadriel's armor looks like it was something designed for the Númenóreans or Gondorians. The same goes for the set design. They definitely look like something from Jackson's films. And even the costume designer Kate Hawley worked on The Hobbit, as did artist John Howe. The showrunners even admit to contacting Peter Jackson, probably to get his input, so there's clearly some attempt to marry this show with those films. The important question though is, what exactly is the source material here? Quote, we have the rights solely to the Fellowship of the Rings, the Two Towers, the Return of the King, the Appendices, and the Hobbit, Payne says. And that's it. We do not have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, or any of the other books. Well, that explains a lot. It was never clear to me what Amazon had purchased. I had heard that they'd gotten the rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but then there were rumors about the show being set in the Second Age, with the rumor being that Amazon could only use that material and nothing from the First Age, both of which were largely handled in the Silmarillion. But it never made much sense that the Tolkien estate would sell off part of the Silmarillion. Now it all makes sense. Essentially, Amazon only has the rights to the stuff that's been floating around for decades, just The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Originally, I thought they were going to give The Lord of the Rings the Game of Thrones treatment, not to ruin the show, but to tell a version of the story closer to the book. Like I said in the previous video, the TV show format is better suited for these long story adaptations, and this is what people want to see. So that begs the question, why didn't Amazon just remake The Lord of the Rings? I think the answer lies in that previous Vanity Fair article, where it was mentioned that Amazon had a vision of what they wanted to do, and that vision was correcting Tolkien's work to make it more representative of the modern world. In other words, they wanted to get rid of all the straight white male characters, but they knew that wouldn't fly with fans since it would erase the entire cast of The Lord of the Rings. So, Amazon decided to delve into the appendices to see what they could fuck up in its place. That led them to the Second Age materials. However, using that is like trying to tell the story of the Clone Wars based solely on Obi-Wan's words in Star Wars. They've got a little more material than that, but not much. We're talking about 30 to 50 pages in the hardcover version of The Return of the King, and that covers the Númenóreans, the Rohirrim, and the Dwarves. It's told in a more biblical style instead of the typical third-person narration found in a novel. It's short and to the point, offering dialogue only where needed. There's not much to work with, and it's made more difficult because without the rights to the other books, you can't mention things that are being hinted at in the appendices but never stated. Deviating from the books or inventing new things is just going to make the problem worse because you're moving further away from what Tolkien wrote and intended and what fans want to see, which is how we end up with things like this new elf-human romance. Quote, these elf-human pairings speak to Tolkien's core preoccupation with mortality. Who gets to live forever? Who doesn't? And what do you give up to be with someone you love? So though the spark between Arondir and Bronwyn does not dominate Season 1's plot, it's a way for McKay and Payne to engage with the story that Tolkien himself found compelling. Remember how that didn't work in The Hobbit? How it made no sense whatsoever because it wasn't moving the plot? How it just completely fell flat? Yeah, so why are you doing it here? All three of the elf-human romances in the First Age are the driving focus of those sections of the Silmarillion. That's what makes them work. It's like they don't understand what Tolkien was getting at, which explains what's up with warrior Galadriel. Is this in the books? No, it's not. As Vanity Fair mentions, in a 1973 letter, Tolkien wrote that Galadriel was like an Amazon and bound her hair up in a crown when doing athletic feats. In the Unfinished Tales, which Amazon doesn't have the rights to, Galadriel, quote, looked upon the dwarves also with the eye of a commander. But there's nothing matching Amazon's nonsense description. Quote, she's full of piss and vinegar, And she's got a sword that's broken because she's killed so many orcs, McKay says of their version. This hot-headed Galadriel, how did she ever become that elder stateswoman? What's more important than Galadriel's armor and weaponry is a turmoil of emotion we see raging inside her, having already survived multiple attacks by Sauron and his predecessor Morgoth, and losing her brothers in the process. Keep in mind that during the War of the Silmarils, Galadriel was wandering around Eriador with her husband Celeborn. He doesn't join her when Galadriel comes back west, however, Celebrian, their daughter, does. By this point, Galadriel is already the wise woman we all know, which is why she sees through Annatar, Sauron, the moment she finds out about him. More troubling, though, is that this inspiration for the piss and vinegar Galadriel is from the famous moment where she says, "All shall love me and despair." That was her rejecting the One Ring, refusing to become that type of person. Yes, Tolkien wrote that the ring played on what she desired when she was younger, but he never stated she behaved that way. Everything he wrote about her suggested that she was proud, and probably prideful, but never angry or arrogant. They're just making it up, which is how we get Isildur being, quote, like Michael Corleone. He's the younger member of the family who has optimism and immaturity. Trace that guy to the tragic final decision rather than the mistake of a fool. And then there's Elrond, quote, working to rebuild damaged alliances with the dwarves, including his old friend, Prince Durin IV. We're going back thousands of years to when the party was in full swing, McKay says. We're going to see the elf capital of Lindon, where Elrond is a young up-and-coming operator within the political scene of the High Elves during their glory day. Or how the showrunners deny the obvious. Will there be wizards? Quote, when asked if this might be Gandalf, Radagast, or Saruman, McKay answered cautiously, well, I would say those are not the only beings, those names, in that class. So maybe, but maybe not. And the mystery and the journey of it is all of the fun, I would say. So the answer is probably yes. This is the problem with Amazon's take. It's like they're not invested in Tolkien's work so much as they are using it to tell a story they really want to tell. This is why they complain about not being able to use passages straight out of the text. So their writer's room that's full of people who've worked on everything from Breaking Bad to Star Trek Discovery turned to Shakespeare and the Bible for inspiration. I mean, if only there was a book Amazon had the rights to that Tolkien wrote that's full of dialogue that they could use to mimic his style to make their dialogue sound like something he would have written. If only. So when Vanity Fair asks, should fans be worried? The answer is yes. The people running this show seem to have an agenda and are just using Tolkien's name to sell their original story. And if you want proof you should be worried, here it is, quote, we've been given something. A stewardship, Payne says. No, you weren't given a damn thing. You bought it. Amazon shelled out hundreds of millions of dollars to get the rights so they could rewrite Tolkien's work into their own image that thankfully everyone's rejecting. No one wants you to come in and revise Tolkien's work so that it lines up with your worldview. We want you to read Tolkien's words and give us your take on what he wrote. Work within the framework of what he created. No one's asking you to come up with something new. If that's your goal, write your own fantasy story. You don't need to take someone else's story and twist it into a shadow of its former self. But there's a better question. Why didn't you just make The Lord of the Rings? You spent 2 whole articles complaining about the lack of source material, but you bought the rights to an entire tome of source material. You can make The Lord of the Rings as it was written, including all the characters that Jackson cut out. I know it's going to be damn near impossible to best Peter Jackson's films, but you didn't even try. Instead, you decided to use Tolkien's name to show your fantasy story, using aspects of the lore you don't even have the full version of. You created this problem for yourself, and then added to it by changing established characters and races, compressing thousands of years of stories into a handful of episodes, and completely ignoring how this didn't work for Peter Jackson. Do you understand? I want to like your show. I'm over here with my fandom like, take it. You must take it. I'm giving it to you. And you're like, don't tempt me, JSG. I dare not take it. Not even to keep it safe. And then you present me with this woke nonsense, and I'm like, I would have gone with you to the end, into the very fires of Mordor. All you had to do was respect Tolkien's work, respect the lore. Instead, all is turned to vain ambition. You'd even use people like me as a cloak. Nearly 100 years these stories have stood. Now, at the whim of Wakandans, they'll fall, because the works of Tolkien were given over to lesser men. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.